He walked out of the courthouse with signed papers in hand, only to freeze when he saw two little girls crying by the door, and realized they knew his name. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps of the courthouse as Kyle Hunt emerged, crisp suit perfectly pressed, phone in hand, and mind already shifting to his next meeting. As the CEO of a billion-dollar real estate empire, his days were tightly controlled, minutes calculated like currency. He wasn't supposed to be here long, just a few signatures, a handshake with the legal team, and then back to the penthouse office where he ran an empire with efficiency and unflinching focus. But just as he reached the edge of the steps, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Two small girls stood near the entrance, close together, hands tightly clasped, their heads bowed. Their identical features, dark hair neatly combed, matching blue backpacks slung over their small shoulders, suggested they were twins, no older than 6. Both wore scuffed sneakers and light jackets, and both had tear-streaked cheeks. Kyle hesitated, which was unusual for him. His instincts, usually sharp and immediate, were drowned out by the slow rise of a strange emotion, one he hadn't felt in years. He moved toward them without quite knowing why. As he approached, he crouched down so he wouldn't tower over them, softening his voice. "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost?" One of the girls blinked up at him with eyes so strikingly blue it almost startled him. "Our mommy is in there," she said quietly, nodding toward the courthouse doors. "They said she might go to jail." Kyle's breath caught before he could reply. The other girl added, her voice more trembly, "We didn't mean to steal. We were just hungry. She works all day, but sometimes there's no food." He froze. The words landed like a punch to the chest. His mind, trained to analyze, to solve, struggled to make sense of what they were saying. "You stole food?" he asked gently. They both nodded. "From a store. Just bread and bananas. They said it was bad and called the police. Mommy said sorry, but now they want to take us away." Kyle's pulse quickened. He looked at them again, really looked. There was something familiar. Not just their eyes or the curve of their cheeks, but something deeper, something in the way they stood, protective of each other, quiet but unafraid to speak the truth. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, though a part of him already feared the answer. "Sarah," one of them whispered. "Sarah Morgan." In that instant, the world tilted. Sarah. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 6 years, but it never left him. They had been young when they met, deeply in love, full of promise. He left her for the world he thought he wanted, promising to come back when everything was stable. He never did. Now here he was, standing in front of 2 children who looked far too much like him to be coincidence. And Sarah, she was inside, alone, facing consequences he hadn't even known she might be living with. He rose to his feet slowly, staring at the courthouse as if seeing it for the first time. Every instinct in his body told him this wasn't just a passing moment. This was a reckoning. He glanced back down at the girls. "Wait here," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on one of their shoulders. "I'm going to find your mom." Then, with a tightening throat and a heart beating like a war drum, Kyle Hunt walked back into the courthouse, not as a CEO, not as a businessman, but as a man whose past had just come calling. Kyle walked back through the courthouse doors with a sense of urgency that didn't match his usual composed demeanor. For most of his life, he'd been able to control every situation, every room, every deal, but now he felt utterly unprepared for what was waiting inside. The soft click of his shoes against the marble floor echoed through the corridors as he made his way toward the courtroom clerk's desk. His voice was lower than usual when he asked, "Is there a hearing today for a woman named Sarah Morgan?" The clerk looked up, flipping through the schedule with a kind of mechanical indifference before giving a nod. "Courtroom B, theft charge. It's in session now." The words hit him harder than they should have. Theft. Sarah. The idea of the woman he had once known being handcuffed, judged, and punished for stealing food was unthinkable. She was proud, fiercely proud. He remembered how she would rather go without than ask for help, how she'd once worked 3 jobs in college just to avoid taking money from her parents. He hadn't seen her since the day she told him she couldn't wait for him anymore. That was 6 years ago. 6 years since she disappeared from his life, without a word, without an explanation. He never asked questions. He just assumed she moved on. He had to. Or at least that's what he told himself. He entered the back of the courtroom as quietly as possible and took a seat. The judge was speaking, flipping through paperwork. On the left side of the room, Sarah stood in a plain navy blouse, her hair pulled back loosely, her face thinner than he remembered but unmistakable. Her expression was calm, composed, but Kyle knew her well enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes low and her lips pressed tight. She looked exhausted. As the store owner gave his testimony, describing how he caught the girls trying to sneak food out in their backpacks, Kyle's eyes never left Sarah. She didn't defend herself much. When asked why she did it, she simply replied, because they were hungry. The judge sighed, clearly torn. "Ms. Morgan, this is not the first time you've been cited for shoplifting, and though I understand your circumstances, the law is the law. We have to consider the welfare of the children." The word sent a chill through Kyle. The welfare of the children. He knew where this was going. The next step would be social services. Removal. Foster care. And those 2 girls, the ones standing helpless outside, would be taken from the only person they had. Before he could stop himself, Kyle stood. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Heads turned, the judge looked up with surprise. "And you are?" "Kyle Hunt. I believe I'm the father of those girls." The room fell silent. Sarah turned sharply, her breath visibly caught in her throat. The judge blinked, then leaned forward. "Is that correct, Ms. Morgan?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes locked on Kyle's. The room around them blurred, faded. There was a quiet war in her gaze, shock, disbelief, maybe even pain, but finally she nodded once. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "He is." The judge glanced at the clerk, scribbled something down, and gestured for Kyle to approach. As he stepped forward, he felt every pair of eyes in the courtroom on him, but none mattered more than Sarah's. "I had no idea," he began. "I didn't know about them. I didn't know she needed help. But I'm here now. I want to take responsibility. I want to help fix this." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you offering, Mr. Hunt?" Kyle took a deep breath. "I will pay any fines. I will ensure Sarah and the girls have a safe place to live. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure those children stay with their mother." The judge was silent for a long moment, tapping his pen thoughtfully. Finally, he said, "This is highly irregular. But I can postpone sentencing. If you are indeed their father, and willing to assist, we'll need verification, documentation, and a family services review." Kyle nodded without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Sarah hadn't said another word. She stared at him like she didn't know whether to thank him or slap him. As the hearing ended and the judge moved on to the next case, Kyle followed Sarah outside the courtroom. She turned to him in the hallway, arms crossed, voice quiet but sharp. "You can't just walk back into my life like this. You left. You chose everything else." "I didn't know," he said simply. "If I had, I wouldn't have walked away." "You were gone for 6 years," she whispered. "I had no choice but to disappear." The silence between them was thick. But then, from the end of the hallway, the girls saw their mother and ran toward her, flinging their arms around her waist. She knelt to hold them, trembling slightly. Kyle watched, heart torn between guilt and awe. When one of the girls looked up at him and asked, "Is he our daddy?" Sarah hesitated. Then she looked back at Kyle. "Yes," she said quietly. "He is." The walk to the parking lot was quiet, almost painfully so. Kyle trailed behind Sarah and the girls, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. His mind spun in a dozen directions at once. He kept staring at the two small figures walking beside her, his daughters. He hadn't known they existed until moments ago, and yet something in him had shifted the second he saw them. It wasn't just guilt. It was a strange, undeniable sense of connection. A part of him he didn't even know was missing had suddenly come into focus. When they reached Sarah's car, it was clear how hard she had been struggling. The back seat was filled with boxes of second-hand clothes, food containers, and worn coloring books. One of the tires looked dangerously underinflated. The girls climbed in without complaint, like this scene was completely normal to them. Sarah turned to Kyle before getting behind the wheel. Her expression was tight, guarded. "You can't fix this with money," she said quietly. "I know what you're thinking. You feel guilty. You think swooping in now makes things better. It doesn't." He didn't argue. "I don't expect to fix anything. I just want to be part of their lives. I want to help, whatever that means, on your terms." She hesitated, the keys in her hand trembling just slightly. "You left and never came back. I tried calling once, right after they were born. But your number had changed. You were on magazine covers by then. I figured you didn't want to know." Her voice didn't break, but her eyes shimmered with emotion she was too proud to let spill. Kyle stepped closer. "I should have been there. I should have looked for you." The sentence hung between them like a bridge that had never been crossed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, but instead of offering it like a CEO, he folded it and handed it to her like something fragile. "I'm staying in town. Here's my address. My cell number. If you ever need anything, or if you even just want to talk, please use it." She looked at it, then tucked it into her purse without a word. "I'll think about it," she said. That was all. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. Later that night, Kyle sat in his apartment, lights dimmed, city skyline glowing beyond the windows. He didn't turn on the television or pour a drink. He just sat there, trying to process what had happened. He had spent the last 6 years growing his empire, thinking he was building something meaningful. But what he had missed, those birthdays, those first steps, those questions they must have asked about where their dad was, he couldn't get that time back. The weight of that loss was crushing. At the same time, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he couldn't walk away again. Not this time. He had always been good at making things happen, at negotiating impossible deals. But this wasn't a deal. It was a life, 2 lives, that he had unknowingly helped create and then abandoned. The next morning, he made calls. Not to lawyers, not to investors, but to a family therapist, a social worker, a pediatrician. He didn't know what Sarah would allow, but he had to be ready. Not to take control, but to show that he meant what he said. That he was willing to earn their trust the hard way. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed in their small apartment, watching the girls sleep. They looked peaceful, unaware of how close everything had come to collapsing. She ran a hand through her hair and reached into her purse, pulling out Kyle's card. She stared at it for a long time, her thumb brushing over the embossed name. 1,000 thoughts swirled in her head: anger, fear, maybe even hope. She didn't know what the right answer was. But for the first time in years, she felt like she didn't have to do it completely alone. And that, as terrifying as it was, gave her reason to breathe just a little easier. Sarah didn't call Kyle the next day, or the day after that. She had read his card more times than she could count, sometimes holding it tightly in her hand while trying to convince herself that reaching out would only complicate things. Her trust had been shattered once before, and the thought of letting Kyle near the girls stirred a storm of conflicting emotions. She had built their lives from scraps, working nights at a diner, taking sewing jobs from neighbors, skipping meals so her daughters wouldn't have to. And yet, despite the struggle, they had been a team, a little unit of three against the world. Letting someone else in, especially the man who had once walked away, felt like inviting chaos into their fragile balance. Still, Kyle had been true to his word. Though he hadn't forced contact, Sarah noticed small changes around her. 2 days after the court hearing, she found an envelope taped to her apartment door. Inside was a gift card to a grocery store with no name attached, just a small note that read, "No strings. Just food. K." She didn't use it right away, but she didn't throw it out either. Another day, the superintendent knocked to tell her that someone had paid to have her car's tire replaced and her oil changed. Kyle had found quiet ways to help without forcing his presence. Meanwhile, Kyle was making his own quiet progress. He visited the social services office voluntarily and submitted to a DNA test, which confirmed what he already knew in his heart, that the girls were his. He attended a session with a family therapist and asked for advice on how to re-enter his children's lives without damaging the trust they had in their mother. He didn't try to rewrite history. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He was just a man trying to do right, finally. By the end of the week, Sarah finally called. Her voice on the other end of the phone was calm but tired. She told him the girls had been asking questions, about the man who stood up in court, the man who offered to help. "I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "They think you're some kind of magician. Or a superhero from a story." Kyle smiled, though his heart ached. "I'd settle for being someone they trust." She paused, then said quietly, "If you really want to be involved, I won't stop you. But you need to come slowly. They've lived without you for 6 years. They won't understand why you're here all of a sudden." Kyle agreed immediately. "Slow is fine. I'm not going anywhere." The first meeting was at a local park. Sarah brought the girls, Emma and Lily, after school one afternoon. Kyle waited at a picnic bench, clutching a paper bag with juice boxes and chocolate chip cookies he'd baked from a box mixed the night before. When the girls saw him, they hesitated for a moment, unsure, before Lily tugged Emma's hand and led her forward. Kyle stood, suddenly uncertain, hands awkwardly at his sides. "Hi," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "I brought cookies. They might be a little weird. I didn't know if you liked the soft kind or the crunchy kind, so I tried both." Lily giggled. "You made both kinds?" Emma asked skeptically. Kyle nodded. "Sort of. One batch got overcooked." Sarah watched from a distance, arms crossed but not intervening. She studied the way the girls responded to him. At first they were shy, but soon they were talking. Kyle knelt beside them on the grass, asking about school, cartoons, and what flavor of ice cream was best in the entire universe. They answered cautiously, then more freely. The laughter came slowly, but it came. After nearly an hour, Sarah walked over and joined them. She sat on the blanket Kyle had brought, and for a moment they all just listened to the wind in the trees. Kyle glanced at her. "Thank you for letting me try." She didn't smile, but her voice was softer. "Let's just see where this goes." As the sun dipped low and they packed up to leave, Emma slipped her hand into Kyle's without looking up. He froze. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. He didn't squeeze too tightly, just enough to let her know he was there. Lily followed, skipping ahead, and Sarah looked over her shoulder with a complicated expression, somewhere between uncertainty and the faintest glimmer of trust. That night, Kyle sat in bed with his phone in hand, scrolling through the single photo Sarah had let him take of the girls sitting in the grass with cookie crumbs on their cheeks. His life had once been filled with photos of buildings, awards, meetings, and suits. But none of them had ever made him feel the way this one did. It was messy, imperfect, and exactly where he wanted to be. For the first time, Kyle didn't think about deals or deadlines. He thought about how to become the kind of man his daughters deserved, and how to keep showing up until he was. Over the next few weeks, a new rhythm began to take shape, fragile and unspoken, but undeniably real. Kyle didn't try to take over. He didn't try to impress or overwhelm. Instead, he showed up consistently, arriving at the park every Wednesday afternoon like clockwork. He brought simple things, a deck of cards, coloring books, snacks he baked himself even when they turned out lopsided. The girls, Emma and Lily, began to expect him. They no longer waited hesitantly at the edge of the path. Instead, they ran to greet him, their small arms wrapping around his waist with the kind of enthusiasm that made his heart ache and heal all at once. Sarah remained cautious. She came to every meeting, always sitting a few feet away, watching carefully. She didn't say much at first, and her eyes betrayed a quiet fear that this new involvement might be temporary, that the moment Kyle's world got too busy, he would disappear again. But Kyle kept showing up, rain or shine, with the same gentle tone and careful attention, never making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He didn't push. He asked questions. He listened. One afternoon, as the wind picked up and leaves scattered across the grass, Emma asked him, "Why did you leave Mommy?" The question was like a slap, not because it was angry, but because it was so innocent. Kyle looked over at Sarah, who paused, clearly unsure whether to stop the conversation. But she didn't. She let it happen. Kyle knelt in the grass beside Emma and Lily, choosing every word with care. "I didn't know she had you," he said slowly. "Back then, I thought I was doing what was best for my life. But I didn't realize that the best part of it was walking away from me. I made a mistake. A really big one. And I'm sorry." Lily tilted her head. "Did you miss us?" Kyle smiled sadly. "More than anything. I just didn't know I was missing you until I saw you. But now I feel it every day, and I don't want to ever feel that empty again." Neither girl spoke right away, but after a long moment, Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. Kyle didn't move. He just let her stay there as long as she needed. Later that evening, Sarah walked with him to the parking lot while the girls played nearby. "You handled that better than I expected," she admitted, glancing sideways. Kyle gave a short nod. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I'd say if I ever got the chance." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why now? Why not 5 years ago?" He sighed, the weight of years heavy in his voice. "Because I was too focused on being successful, on chasing what I thought mattered. And because I was a coward. I thought disappearing would hurt less than trying and failing. I was wrong." Sarah didn't reply, but she didn't turn away either. The following week, Kyle asked if he could pick the girls up from school. Sarah hesitated, but agreed, asking to come with him the first time. Kyle arrived early, standing awkwardly outside the school gate with a folded piece of paper in his hands, a permission slip Sarah had filled out, just in case. When the bell rang and the doors opened, Emma and Lily burst out like sunshine, their backpacks bouncing and faces lit up. "Daddy!" Lily shouted, the word slipping out so naturally that it made Sarah blink. Kyle didn't flinch. He opened his arms and hugged them tightly. That one word, spoken so effortlessly, echoed in his head the rest of the day. As the weeks passed, Sarah allowed more small steps. Kyle began helping with homework, reading bedtime stories over video calls when he couldn't be there in person, showing up for dentist appointments and parent-teacher meetings. Slowly, he started to feel like more than just a guest in their lives. The apartment Kyle once filled with silence and ambition was now filled with crayons, stuffed animals, tiny shoes, and sometimes, soft lullabies sung through a phone speaker. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep during a visit to Kyle's place, Sarah stayed behind for tea. They sat on the balcony as the city hummed quietly below. "They're happier," she said softly. "I haven't seen them laugh this much in years." Kyle looked down into his mug. "I wish I could undo the time I lost." Sarah shook her head. "You can't. But you can be here now. And they can feel that. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, not yet. But it was something real. The kind of truth that grows slowly, watered by effort and time. Kyle knew there was still a long road ahead. There were wounds he couldn't erase, mistakes that would always live in the background. But as he kissed his daughters' foreheads that night and watched them sleep peacefully, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope that maybe, just maybe, this story could still become something beautiful. As winter settled into the city and the air grew sharper, Kyle's life continued to shift in ways he had never expected. It was subtle at first, a new routine here, a changed habit there, but the transformation became impossible to ignore. His mornings, once consumed by early calls and stock reports, now often began with school drop-offs or last-minute searches for missing gloves and homework folders. The boardroom, which once felt like his domain, now shared space in his thoughts with lunchboxes, pediatric checkups, and art projects taped to the refrigerator in his condo. Kyle had never been the type to embrace chaos, but the kind of disorder that came with fatherhood was something he welcomed with surprising ease. Sarah remained careful with boundaries. She still lived in the same modest apartment, still worked long hours when the girls were asleep, still shouldered the bulk of the parenting. But the walls around her were no longer made of iron. They were shifting. She allowed Kyle to take the girls to the library on weekends, to host them overnight when her shifts ran too long, and even to be the one they called when their favorite toy went missing or when they wanted pancakes at dinner. More than once, Sarah found herself listening to their stories about what Daddy said or what Daddy taught us, and the ache that once accompanied those words began to dull, replaced by something quieter and more unfamiliar, peace. One evening, Kyle picked up the girls from their after-school program. The building was buzzing with noise, but his focus was on Emma, who had been unusually quiet during the car ride. When he asked what was wrong, she hesitated, then whispered, "We have a show at school next week. A little play. Everyone's mommy and daddy are coming. Can you come too?" Kyle blinked at the question. "Of course I can," he said without hesitation. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." But when the day of the play arrived, Kyle felt a strange nervousness settle over him. He had spoken to crowds of hundreds, closed multi-million-dollar deals, been featured in financial magazines, but none of it had ever made his palms sweat like the idea of sitting in the second row of a school auditorium, trying not to cry while his daughters performed as snowflakes. The show was simple, filled with mismatched costumes and forgotten lines, but Kyle could hardly breathe watching Emma and Lily twirl and sing, their faces scanning the crowd until they found his. Their smiles, when they saw him there beside Sarah, nearly undid him. Afterward, the girls ran up, still wearing their tinsel crowns, and hugged him so tightly he couldn't speak. Sarah took photos. She even asked him if he wanted copies sent to his phone. It felt like a small miracle. A few days later, Kyle invited Sarah to dinner, not with the girls, not as co-parents, but just the two of them. He didn't frame it as romantic. He simply said, "We've both been doing everything for them. Maybe we deserve one night where someone cooks for us." To his surprise, she said yes. They met at a quiet restaurant. It wasn't fancy, not like the places Kyle used to entertain clients, but it was warm, candlelit, with wood tables and handwritten menus. Sarah wore a soft green sweater and no makeup. She looked tired, but beautiful in a way that knocked the breath out of him. The conversation started cautiously, but it eased as the night went on. They talked about the girls, about how Lily had started drawing animals with strangely specific eyelashes, and how Emma had asked if snowflakes had best friends. Then the conversation turned, slowly, to the past. Sarah told him how alone she had felt after he left, how scared she'd been when she found out she was pregnant, how she tried to call but gave up after too many disconnected lines. She told him about working nights, about holding a baby in each arm and wondering if they would ever have more than just enough to survive. Kyle listened without interrupting. When she was done, he didn't offer excuses. He just said, "I wasn't there. And I should have been." They didn't define what the evening meant. There were no promises, no declarations. But when he walked her to her car, and she didn't immediately step away, he understood something had changed. That night, Kyle returned home and found himself staring out at the city, remembering the version of himself that once stood alone in that same spot, rich, powerful, but hollow. Now he had fingerprints on his windows, glitter stuck in his carpet, and a calendar filled with spelling tests and dance recitals. He had no idea what the future with Sarah might look like, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer running from anything. He was finally, fully, showing up. The beginning of the new year brought with it a kind of quiet warmth that had little to do with the weather outside. Kyle noticed that the chill in the air didn't seem as sharp when he held his daughter's hands on the way to school, when he picked out their mittens in the mornings or heard their laughter echoing in the hallway of his once sterile apartment. What used to be a cold, glass-walled fortress of solitude now held life: blankets on the couch, children's books stacked on the coffee table, drawings taped crookedly to the fridge. It was no longer a bachelor's high-rise. It was becoming a home. Sarah, too, had begun to soften. Though she was still cautious, still guarded in her way, she no longer kept her distance emotionally. She and Kyle had started texting regularly, updates about the girls, yes, but also short jokes, things they saw in the news, the kind of casual familiarity that once came so easily. They weren't back together, not officially, but something was rebuilding, layer by layer, as if they were quietly laying down bricks towards something neither had dared hope for. Kyle didn't rush her. He understood that trust once broken isn't repaired by grand gestures, but by presence, by consistency, by the small, everyday acts that prove someone isn't going anywhere this time. One weekend, Sarah called him unexpectedly. Her voice was tense, and Kyle immediately straightened, concerned. "Can you come over?" "It's nothing bad," she added quickly, "just. I think it's time you saw something." Curious and slightly nervous, he arrived 20 minutes later. Sarah greeted him at the door, her expression unreadable, and motioned for him to follow her to the bedroom. She reached into the closet and pulled out a faded cardboard box, worn around the edges. Inside were years of quiet memories, baby photos, old pacifiers, first scribbled drawings, and a stack of letters, never sent, written by Sarah in longhand during the hardest nights of her life. Letters addressed to Kyle. Some were angry, some desperate, some filled with sorrow or exhaustion or hope. She handed them to him without a word, then stepped back, letting him take them home. Kyle stayed up almost all night reading them, unable to stop. Her pain, her strength, her loneliness, every word stripped away the version of reality he had built for himself during those years. He thought he had moved on. He thought they had simply grown apart. But now he saw what she had gone through in vivid detail. Each page was a window into the life he had missed, the one he was now desperate to be part of. The next morning, he showed up at her door before she even had a chance to call. She looked surprised, her eyes still tired from sleep. He didn't ask to come in. He simply said, "I read every word. And I wish I could go back and rewrite all of it. But since I can't, I just want to spend every day ahead of us proving I'm here now. Whatever that means to you." Sarah didn't respond right away. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded. For a moment, it felt like she might shut him out. But then she stepped aside. "Come in. The girls want waffles." It was such an ordinary sentence, but it felt like an invitation to a new chapter. They spent the morning making waffles, burning the first batch, laughing through the mess. The girls sat at the table with syrup-sticky fingers and chocolate milk mustaches, and Kyle couldn't stop smiling. He watched Sarah move through the kitchen, watched the ease between them all, and something settled inside him. He had spent years chasing a future he thought he wanted, only to discover the real thing had been waiting all along, hidden behind silence and hurt and the passing of time. That night, as they cleaned up together, Sarah turned to him. Her voice was quiet. "I don't know what this is yet. I'm not ready to define anything. But I do know I'm not scared of you being around anymore." He nodded. "That's enough for me." The trust was growing. Not in leaps, but in steady, careful steps. Kyle didn't need declarations or dramatic reunions. He had learned that the most meaningful stories aren't written in climaxes, but in the day-to-day, in showing up when it matters, in listening without needing to fix everything. In this chapter of their lives, love wasn't about second chances. It was about building something new from what had survived. And that, he realized, might be even better. Spring arrived slowly, but when it came, it brought more than blooming trees and longer days. It brought with it the quiet certainty that something permanent had taken root between Kyle, Sarah, and their daughters. It wasn't a grand transformation. There were no sweeping declarations or dramatic milestones. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, consistent moments that began to reshape their lives. Mornings turned into family breakfasts. Weekends were spent with the four of them together, sometimes at parks, sometimes in bookstores, sometimes just walking around the neighborhood without a destination. And through it all, the tension that once sat between Sarah and Kyle began to dissolve. There were still questions. The past didn't disappear just because they were now living in the present together. But Sarah, for the first time in years, stopped looking over her shoulder waiting for things to fall apart. She started to believe that this new version of Kyle, the one who helped with school projects, who learned how to braid Emma's hair, who practiced bedtime stories until he got every word right, was here to stay. She no longer needed to test him with skepticism. He had passed every test already by simply being there and never giving up when things were hard or awkward or unfamiliar. One Saturday evening, the girls were at a sleepover at their friend's house, giving Kyle and Sarah a rare night to themselves. They made dinner together in her small kitchen. There was laughter and a natural ease that hadn't existed between them even in the early days of their relationship. After dinner, they sat on her couch, a half-watched movie flickering in the background. Sarah turned to him, her face serious but calm. "I've been thinking," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "You've done everything you said you would. And more. You didn't walk away. You didn't make promises and disappear. You showed up and kept showing up, even when it was hard. I don't know how to describe what that means to me. What it means to them." Kyle didn't rush to speak. He let her continue. "I spent so long thinking I had to do this all alone. And I could have. I did. But I don't want to anymore. I don't want to carry the weight by myself when you've shown me you're willing to carry it with me." She looked up, and their eyes met. "I think I'm ready. Not just for co-parenting. For more. For us." For a long time, Kyle didn't say anything. He simply reached for her hand, holding it gently, not as a symbol of ownership or victory, but as someone anchoring himself in something real. "I've loved you for a long time," he said quietly. "Even when I didn't deserve to. Even when I was too stupid to say it." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. The moment didn't need any more words. The weight of 6 years had finally been lifted. What remained was something lighter, something whole. Weeks later, the girls stood in matching dresses at a small gathering in the city garden, holding little bouquets of flowers and giggling as their parents exchanged simple vows under a canopy of spring blossoms. There was no audience beyond close friends and a few neighbors. No photographers, no media coverage. Just them. Just family. The ceremony was brief, but the joy in the girls' faces as they danced in the grass afterward made it feel like the most important event in the world. Later, Emma whispered to Kyle, "Does this mean we're a real family now?" He smiled, kneeling to her level. "We were always a real family. This just makes it official." As night fell and the last of the guests drifted home, Kyle stood beside Sarah, holding her hand while the girls played in the grass nearby. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but he wasn't thinking about work, or meetings, or headlines. He was thinking about bedtime stories and pancake breakfasts and the quiet strength of second chances. This wasn't the life he once planned. It was better. It was real. It was earned. This story's ending is powerful because it doesn't rely on fairy tale perfection, it thrives on growth, accountability, and emotional honesty. What makes it especially meaningful is that Kyle doesn't redeem himself with a grand gesture, but through patient, consistent presence. The final chapter isn't about erasing the past, it's about earning trust through time and proving love with action, not words. Sarah's willingness to forgive, not blindly, but cautiously, with boundaries, feels grounded and human. The girls aren't just props for reconciliation, they are emotional anchors, reminding both parents of what truly matters. And the quiet beauty of a simple wedding, surrounded by real love rather than luxury, closes the arc not with spectacle but with sincerity. Ultimately, the story reminds us that real transformation isn't loud, it's steady, earned, and deeply personal. It's not about rewriting history. It's about writing a better future, one honest page at a time.